get hit by a good-sized piece, you know you've been hit. Well, there was 21,000 of them on that island, and there's the miners. They had they had miners from China and Korea that was forced labor that helped carve that island out. And the island was 7 miles long, but there was 21 miles of tunnels in there. And then they had tracks in there, and you could, at night you could hear them little suckers running around down there, and tracks hauling ammunition from one end to the other, supplying, you know, they get run out of one place, or if they got knocked out there, they'd move in a gun to replace it. And you didn't see none of that because it was all underground. Us, you'd act as spotters if you were fortunate enough while you were moving. If you seen something that you thought there was a hole, that you try to get the attention. And thank God for the flamethrowers, the guys with flamethrowers, but they were really targets. But what really saved us, I think most of it, the credit can go to the tankers, the guys that had tanks with the flamethrowers. But they were targets for the Japanese big time. And if you were anywhere near one of those things, you can make up your mind. There was a lot of shells and fragments flying. That was the worst job in the world on Iwo, because of the fact that that thing weighs 70, 80 pounds. You have to run with that sucker, and you don't run very fast with the 70, 80 pounds on your back when you're crouched in that tank, and then you got that hose in front of you. You can't swing your arms too far because your hands are full. Well, they were burnt out, and evidently the grenades that we threw, a lot of that, we got, no question about it, we got a lot of them with the grenades. And as far as with actually shooting them like target practice, that never happened. And of course, when you use a flamethrower, and if there's 50 of them in that particular area, and it burns the oxygen out, and if they don't all come out and they die before you get there, you never see them. And it's even worse when a tank does it, because of the fact that if it's 9 times out of 10, it's a bigger target. And God only knows how many people that got suffocated down there. There probably could have been 400 or 500 people in that particular room or area that got suffocated, and they stayed there. You know, and it was that's the only thing you could say, because you can't go and say, well, I killed so many with a rifle. Well, most of the time that didn't happen. The only time you used a rifle was to get some that were coming out of caves on fire, and they shot them. But see, the only other time that you see the Japanese that you could get a shot at, if you were lucky, was one that was on fire, coming out of one of those holes, and somebody get them, you know. And that's the only time you've seen one moving. There was never any prisoners, never. And the sergeant says, there was no way. The only time we ever got any prisoners on Iwo Jima is when we had the island secured, and there was 300 of them that came out and started cutting the throats of those airmen that were in the bunks there, and that's where they ended up out of those 300, or some say there was 300 or 400 of them that came out. Anyway, that's the time that they got over 100 prisoners, 100 Japanese that actually lived that they could interview. The Japanese had, they took care of each other as much as they possibly could, you know, the Marines, there aren't too many of them that went down in those caves because of the fact that a lot of those bodies were booby-trapped. And see, a lot of those, too, they booby-trapped a lot of those mines. A lot of them went off by themselves, too. Yeah, some of those guys that the guys that got a chance to shoot coming out, yeah, he could put a whole clip in them. And see, most of them were drunk on sake. You know, they're out of their mind, because you know when they come screaming at you banzai, you know that they're on something. They found out later through the letters and their letters and stuff that their families knew they weren't coming back, and that the general said you're going to get 10 Americans for every one of the Japanese they get of us Japanese. Well, you were. Mentally, you were exhausted. Physically, you know, boy, you had a move, and if you didn't, that was the end of it. But mentally, that was hard. That would really wore you down because of the fact that You never knew what the next moment was going to be like, you know. It was hell. You know, you couldn't sleep, for one thing. You're so damn terrified, you know. And you crawl in your hole and you make sure that you kept looking out to see if you've seen anything, any movement at all, you know. And then when your time was up, then the next guy filled in and you try to go on rotation. And sometimes if you were lucky, like the first time we had 3 guys, you know, and that made it a hell of a lot easier. But those guys, you know, they'd probably get underneath their poncho and try to light up a cigarette so they wouldn't be seen and try to calm their nerves. Well, that one night when we had that, wasn't a bonsai attack, but they sneak in, crawling, and when all hell broke loose that night, and boy, we had some extra grenades, and I tell you, we threw grenades, and I could heave one of those pretty good. And the next morning, that line, all the stretch across that line, I think Bob had verified some of that there was Japanese were piled up, a lot of them piled up, one on top of the other. But a lot of them got into the holes, and the Marines had to take care of them in there with their knives. I changed guns about 3 different times. And one time I had to carry a bar, but I didn't have enough ammunition, and there was no way in hell. So the first chance I got my hands on a rifle, you know. And all you have to do is throw away the clip and nobody could use the damn thing. When we got in the tail end of it from the second airfield going back, that was all a rock pile, and there was a lot of ravines and gullies and stuff, and you know, and they had to be flushed out of there. So that took quite a while because of the fact that you'd get it one place and you get them cleaned out of one spot, and then there was another one covering it. And that's what took us that extra time. Our main purpose was to look to see if you could find a hole that they could shoot out of, or that you could use for a flamethrower to get in there and burn them out of those caves. And without that, you know, but the trouble with that was the flamethrower tanks couldn't get in there because it was too rough. They couldn't operate in there. I know we got a bulldozer up there where the bulldozer was going to go in there and clean a track, or they fill up the holes. Anything that we spot there was a hole, the bulldozer tried to get in there and fill that up. The ones that could be moved in bulldozers, and you get a bulldozer or a tank with a bulldozer on, a blade on it, that would move a lot of that stuff away and push it aside. Or find a big shell hole and they pull it in and carry it up, cover it up. Well, the only guys that monkeyed around with the dead Japanese were the guys that were digging the gold out of their teeth with a shovel. That's the only guys, because I sure in hell wasn't going to go around and see if they had any letters or maps on them, or having a Japanese flag. Some guys took a lot of risks to get those Japanese flags because of the fact that most of those dead Japanese were booby-trapped. And if you weren't careful and get hooked in there, you better have something, a wire that you can reach down there and move that body, because 9 times out of 10 they had a booby trapped on you. And as far as souvenirs is concerned, that was the last damn thing I was on my mind. I wasn't looking for no souvenirs. I wanted to get the hell out of there. And when you did move, you got up and you ran like hell, and hopefully that you could recognize some of the things while you were still up. Because the first thing you do when it was all going, when you see the ground getting tore up around you, you know damn well somebody's got a machine gun on it or something, so you dive in the first hole you can get. And that's where you progress. And sometimes you can't do that, so what you do is you crawl out there and you open as much as you can. Well, the spider web, that was those trees that were broken off, and they had those limbs that were like feet, and that was air holes. We found out later that was air holes for ventilation, and then they'd have the Japanese were in there. They had like a fort inside that part, and then they could stick a rifle or whatever you had to do. And when you spotted one of those, the only thing you could do is if you could get close enough to throw a grenade, but it's pretty dang hard to hit a spot where you only got a hole about that big with a grenade. So you point it out to the flamethrower. The flamethrower guy would, nail it, or point it out to a tank, and you can do that with your rifle. Well, that was one of my friends that got it later. Well, he got hit by a shell, and it tore part of his leg, probably about 20 or 30 yards. And then we dragged him in. But we were lucky. We were lucky because of the fact that at the time the shelling had moved to the right or left, and that relieved you enough time to do it. And then we got him into a hole in a corpsman, and we used this carbine as a tourniquet, the nose of it, and then got it fixed so that he could go on a stretcher, and we got a stretcher crew in and got him on board the stretcher. And when he left the stretcher, it was a Japanese that was covering that, waited till he got out of the hole, and then they started firing, and then a shell, then the mortar shell took all 5 of them out. That was the end of it right there. And that was a time when the firing really had increased to begin with, and so it was a bad time. If you could have thought that the corpsman thought if you could wait a little bit longer, but then you don't know how long. How long do you wait before you can get somebody back to the aid station, because you're losing lost a lot of blood. But you're so terrified, you're not thinking of anybody but getting that poor devil out of there. I mean, that's your job. You're there to protect each other, and you're working like you're numb. And a lot of that numbness, and I think, comes from the fact of the thoughts and the impression that's embedded in your mind as this is going on. What can you do? What can you do? And then you got some people hollering, screaming for the corpsman to get over there, and then you got to call in another corpsman, and the corpsmen are pretty darn busy. They're running from one hole to another, and hopefully that you can get one, in the area, because of the fact that you hear other guys getting it, and there's not much you can do. They can be a fox old buddy to anybody. I'll put them alongside a Marine. And they did it just like the Marine. That was his job, to go out there and get them, it's like having a flamethrower, because the Japanese are smart enough to know which one's the corpsman and which one's not. They had that big kit flopping around on the back of them, and they had to move, to get from one hole to another. And not only that, you can hear, when there's shelling, you can hear somebody crying from a hole, and which hole you're in. There's holes all over the place, And if you're fortunate enough to have one deep enough to get into, because a lot of times when them shells break and explode over the top of you, there's a lot of stuff, hot metal coming off of them. And we lost that corpsman. We lost a lot of corpsmen there. In that 36 days of that battle, there was 900 corpsmen and 89 doctors that either got killed or wounded. Well, we lost 4 or 5 lieutenants in the matter of the 32 days I was on there, that we actually knew they were our lieutenants. Whether they were killed or wounded, they were replaced, And who takes command next is the sergeant. And then if there's nobody there, it's the corporal. And see, that's why in the Marines, you got to be in and go through a battle, and before they made you a PFC, and then from a private I went to PFC. That was my big title when I left. I was on there until the end, the 36th day. Then we pulled out. Then the last day before we pulled out, the area we were getting ready to be shipped out. We would visit the cemetery below Mount Suribachi. You look for alphabetical order of some of the guys that you knew, and then you said your prayer there. And that was well. The trouble was because of the fact that you lost so many of the guys in your unit,